Hello, thank you for viewing my talk on designing post-trauma self-regulation apps for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. My name is Krishna Venkata Subramanian and I'm from the University of Rhode Island. This work was done in collaboration with my colleague Tina Marie Rinaldi. Trauma is a sudden, potentially deadly experience that often leaves lasting and troubling memories. In the US, a significant number of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD, are suspected to have experienced trauma in their lifetimes. In the US, majority of people with IDD who experience trauma may not get sufficient help to cope and to improve their quality of life. There are several reasons for this, including a lack of therapists, diagnostic overshadowing, where a medical provider attributes any negative effects of trauma to the person's disability, stigma associated with getting help, and logistical problems such as lack of transportation. Trauma affects people with IDD in profound ways, such as causing impaired working memory, depression, and excessive distraction. All of this is often made worse for people with IDD who are unable to avoid triggers because of their limited control over their own environment. Therefore, the negative effects of trauma on an individual with IDD needs to be managed on an ongoing basis. In this work, we specifically avoid looking at negative effects of trauma through a medicalized therapy-based lens. Rather, we approach the post-trauma state from the standpoint of what some humanities scholars term dis-ease. Such post-trauma dis-ease can present itself in many ways, including a general sense of grief, depression, anxiety, self-harming behavior, etc. We view this sense of dis-ease as a legitimate response to trauma that needs to be managed. In this work, we want to design post-trauma self-regulation apps as a means to help people with IDD deal with their trauma. We define post-trauma self-regulation, or PTSR, as engaging in one or more activities that regulate one's emotions to help cope with the state of dis-ease. PTSR should be seen as complementary to any therapy in which a person might engage. Consequently, the focus of this paper is about the larger design considerations of apps that provide PTSR for people with IDD. Prior work on self-regulation has focused on three broad areas: research apps for non-trauma self-regulation, commercial apps for non-trauma self-regulation, and non-commercial apps for post-trauma self-regulation. However, none of these prior work has been designed to be accessible to people with IDD or for them to perform PTSR autonomously. Please refer to our paper for more details on how existing work does not meet the needs of people with IDD in this regard. To develop our design considerations for PTSR apps, we conducted an interview study involving 8 employees of a trauma services unit within an adult protective services agency who help people with IDD with self-regulation. Our goal was to answer 3 broad research questions. 1. What does post-trauma self-regulation, or PTSR, for people with IDD entail? 2. Do people with IDD use apps or technologies for PTSR? If so, how? And what should designers be mindful of when they design PTSR apps for someone with IDD? From the interview study, we found, broadly speaking, PTSR should enable people with IDD to gain control over their lives as a way to mitigate some of the effects of their trauma. Further, they wanted activities involved in PTSR to be diverse to meet the individualized needs of people with IDD. When asked about the use of technology by people with IDD to engage in PTSR, we found that people with IDD use extant apps, such as social media, as ersatz PTSR apps. That is, people with IDD are looking for technological solutions, such as apps, to self-regulate. However, none of the ersatz apps is well suited for people with IDD in this regard. Finally, our participants stated that any PTSR app should be accessible for autonomous use by people with IDD. Further, it should be intersectionally inclusive and promote social connection in its design. You can find more details about these results in our paper. Based on our findings, we posit that one of the best ways of approaching the design of PTSR apps for people with IDD is to leverage the notion of trauma-informed care, or TIC, from the domain of social work. TIC was originally proposed as a criteria for organizations trying to help traumatized individuals. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the US, any organization seeking to provide TIC services must satisfy 5 core criteria: safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. In this paper, we redefined these 5 criteria from the standpoint of designing PTSR apps and came up with 12 design guidelines that fall within these criteria. We then argued that following these guidelines would make PTSR apps for people with IDD trauma-informed. For more details on the TIC criteria and the 12 guidelines, please see our paper. In conclusion, trauma is a big problem for people with IDD. In this work, we focused on designing post-trauma self-regulation, or PTSR apps, to help people with IDD deal with the negative effects of trauma. In this regard, we argue for the use of the notion of trauma-informed care in the design of such PTSR apps. Thank you for listening to my talk. You can get in touch with me by emailing me at krish@uri.edu. Thank you.